Hi students, my name is Nicola. I am the English lecturer from Pretoria, and I'm going to be taking you through Heart of Darkness. So we're going to start straight away. It is quite a complex section, and some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about is, particularly when we're talking about context stuff, it's a little bit disturbing, so be a little bit prepared for some slightly macabre imagery and some very difficult discussions, particularly in reference to race. So we're going to start with learning outcome 1.1, which is explain the historical context of Hearts of Darkness within the African colonial period. So what I'm going to start with doing is I'm going to break down the historical context of this period, and we're going to discuss how this is impacted on this type of thing. So before we start, I want you to think of the title of the text, and this needs to be something that you keep in the back of your mind for the entire session of lectures, both with me as well as with your full-time lecturer. And I want you to think about what the idea of Heart of Darkness means. And I've got some very twee images here, but they do help to convey what I'm trying to communicate. The first is a heart made of darkness, and the second one is darkness, the heart of the darkness. So try and think about what those two different things imply about the title, and why do you think the possible title by Conrad is relatively vague? Because he doesn't stipulate which of these interpretations of this title you need to look at. So while we're going through this content, I want this to sort of percolate at the back of your heads, and I want you to think about what the implications of the ambiguity of this title might insinuate. So before we go on, I'm just going to talk a little bit about Conrad himself. One of the first things that I want to mention is that he's a second language English user himself, which just goes to prove that not every piece of canonical English literature has to be written by someone from England, which is great. He was Polish-British, so I think his mother was British and his dad was Polish. And he was born in Poland, and he spent a great deal of time growing up in quite very poor circumstances. And he was raised speaking primarily Polish, and then he learned to speak English at the same time, but he wasn't really fluent until his 20s. And he had a very complex growing up because most of the time he spent with his father, who was a political activist, was in trouble a lot with the Russians, and a farmer at the same time. So his way of providing for his family was being a farmer. And if you're a farmer and not on your farm, you can imagine the consequences thereof. Conrad himself, and as I've shown you with this older picture, went on to become a merchant mariner, which means he transported goods. So he was a sailor, but he wasn't in the Navy, and he would sail from different parts of the world to transport goods from one place to another. And this did become problematic at points because it was a very uncertain financial position to be in. If you lost a load, or if pirates attacked, or if anything possibly went wrong, you would be responsible for those goods and you would lose all of the possible profit you could have earned. So he had tried to commit suicide at least once due to financial pressures as a captain, because not only are you affecting yourself, but all of your employees as well. If we're going to talk about the genre of style of writing or the period he belongs to, we generally consider him to be a very early modernist. Now, you don't need to know this for now, but it is useful to think about him in terms of modernism next year and third year when you guys are doing modernism. I have a really nice little video here that explains modernism if you want to engage with it. It is not essential for this series of lectures, though. So that's generally a little bit about him. Something to keep in mind is that all of his writings are informed by his experiences as a sailor. So Nostromo was also set on a ship, and if you look at Heart of Darkness, although it's not a ship that travels out of a continent, it is a steamer that travels, or a small steamer that travels along a river within Africa, and he is still the captain of a ship. So all of the experiences or most of the experiences that Conrad wrote about were things that he experienced himself. So let's talk about the colonial era. The period of time that we are going to be talking about is the sort of late 1800s, and this was towards the end of the colonial period. Obviously, Africa had been colonized in the early 1600s by the British, the Portuguese, much later by the Germans, by the French, and I've actually got an intentionally, I've chosen a picture of Africa with all of the countries that have colonized the different parts of Africa during this time, which is, it's going to be insightful to you because we're going to be looking at one specific area and one unusual colonizer. At this point in time, Africa was one of the continents that they had discovered quite late in the game that was very rich in resources. If you think about where colonization started, most of it was for the materials in places like India and China and America. And Africa was discovered quite late in the game to be very mineral rich for raw materials. So civilizations only really started popping up, and I say civilizations in inverted commas, only started popping up really to most effect in the 1800s. So when you're looking at this, what happens at this point in time is that the colonies were not intended initially to be outposts of civilization, which is something that the colonizers used to argue. They used to argue, oh, we're going to civilize a savage world. Please note that I'm saying that in inverted commas. And that was not the case at all. Much of the intention at this point in time was genuinely and purely and very honestly to exploit the colonies and the land that they could claim for the profit that they had. So whatever raw material that they could have access to, they would try and plunder as much as possible. And if they didn't have natural resources, they would then exploit the people, which is obviously how we get to slavery. So this is just a map of the different countries. So obviously I've got this lovely map here of the different flags, which is nice, but sometimes it helps to take an idea of how dominant certain countries were in controlling parts of Africa. So the little color is France, this brown is England, and then you will have your other odder and unusual ones like Germany, which only managed to colonize much, much later in the 1990s, a tiny portion of Africa being Namibia, and then you've got your various other countries that would take control, like Western Sahara, and you would have your Portuguese colonies. Where we are is in the Democratic Republic of Congo, or what would have been called the heart of Africa at the time, and the heart of darkness. So first hint towards our title. It would have been considered, and it was considered for a very long period of time, the darkest part of Africa, because there was absolutely no infrastructure there. And at this point in time, it was controlled by the Belgian king. And it was, and apologies for the very dramatic imagery, but I have chosen this for a specific purpose. Congo was unusual because Congo was controlled by the Belgian king Leopold II, and it was privately colonized, which means that this was not an empire endeavor. What he wanted was he wanted to financially exploit a piece of land and the people within it to the utmost degree. And in the Congo at the time, one of the big things that was being exploited was not only the people, but the two things and the two products that were very prominent in Congo, which was ivory, which we're going to talk about a lot in the future lectures, but also rubber. So there would be massive rubber plantations. To put this in context, rubber, before we learned how to make fake rubber, or plastic rubber, so rubber that was manufactured, rubber comes from a plant. And there used to be large plantations both in the DRC and in places like Vietnam, where the plant grew naturally. So something to keep in mind is that the DRC went through an extremely violent and an extremely aggressive form of colonialization. But it was also a type of colonialization that was steered purely by profit, and there was no overseeing power like a government to control the actions of the people within. And so there was no one controlling the colonizers, which is to say there wasn't much in most of the other countries, but this was a particularly extreme and is usually used as one of the most violent versions of control that we have seen under colonizers. Something to keep in mind is that the colonizing force that controlled the populace was something called force publique, which was, it basically means the public force, and they were actually a mercenary force. They were not the army, and they were not legal employees of the state. They were purely employed by King Leopold II himself. So when we're looking at this context, we need to remember that the situation we're going into is a time that is incredibly violent. The exploitation is something that we have not seen outside of the DRC to the extremes that we see in other places. And the violence that resounds in the DRC is still very much ingrained in the society now. The DRC is still one of the most violent places in Africa, and a lot of it is due to this heritage of the way that they were so violently and aggressively colonized. So here's a bit of a video which I really like by, he's one of my favorite YouTubers, and his name is Tom Nicholas. And he is a PhD student who does this really good job of breaking down some concepts in a little bit more depth than I'm able to. And he explains what colonialism is, and he explains what post-colonialism is very effectively. So if you want to go and engage with, and the videos are very nice, he has excellent resources. What I would like you to do is when you're watching this, just keep aware that he knows as a white English male that he's talking about something that his ancestors have done. And I think that that's something you should keep at the back of your mind. And something else that you should keep in the back of your mind about colonialism is the fact that this should make you uncomfortable, because we often talk about colonialization, we talk about decolonialization, but often we forget the consequences of what those actions were. We forget how violent, how aggressive, how unbelievably abusive the situation was from one small section of the world onto almost the entire rest of the world. And something I want you to keep in mind for where we go next, at the back of your head, is that all of this, and well, at least majority of this, was done exclusively for the purposes of profit. And this was controlled for that purpose. It was not done with humanitarian purposes in mind. That was often the stuff that was used to validate and support the ideas that were coming across. So here's a couple of ideas of what I want you to think about that Heart of Darkness wants to discuss. Because one of the things that we are going to have to discuss and decide for ourselves as readers is Heart of Darkness a colonial text? Was it written during the colonial period and reflects on colonial texts? Or is this text a post-colonial text? Now, you should be familiar with post-colonialism to an extent from Wide Psychosoc that you did in first year. So what we're talking about here is which of those two styles of writing and time periods does this text fall into? Now, obviously, I'm raising this because there's a big question mark next to it. One of the things that we're going to talk about is how does Heart of Darkness deal with the ideas of what is civilized versus what is not civilized. This text is problematic, and something you should keep in mind is that there is no way that this text is going to come across without complexities. This is not a text that is just easy to classify and easily to put into one field and just go, okay, that's the box it fits into. Heart of Darkness is difficult to talk about, and it's difficult to engage with. And the way that engages with these ideas is complex and it's difficult, and you should be very aware of this complexity. So when we talk about Heart of Darkness and discussing the civilized world, you're going to see the underlying imperial ideas sorry, that come across from countries like England, from Europe, from almost every colonizing nation. You're going to see the perceptions of what civilization is, but that should also be questioned in the text. We're going to talk about how colonialism was legitimized by savagery, because colonialism argued that we can't let people keep behaving like savages. We need to teach them. We need to educate them. We need to make them better. I hope you're hearing the sarcasm in my voice, because a lot of what this text does is it says, are we doing that, or are we barbarians? And it's asking the question about where does savagery fall, and what makes someone savage and what makes someone not savage. The next thing that Heart of Darkness is going to discuss is how colonialism was created by the need for profit, but it was maintained by this sort of moral and political power. Because once the colonists sunk their teeth into an area, they would go, no, we are here. We are here to uplift the peoples. We're here to civilize these peoples. We're here to educate, and we're going to convert them to Christianity. And these are the ideas that came across. And Heart of Darkness questions and says, well, if you're saying that, is that really happening? And is that for the good of the people? Is that beneficial at all? The other thing that Heart of Darkness talks about is the fact that majority of people at this point in time argued that places in Africa and in Southeast Asia and in India were incapable of self-government, meaning that they could not govern themselves. They had no ability to be their own leaders, which obviously raises the question of, well, how have they been doing it before now? It's not as if people were just wandering around by themselves in individual groups alone in the wilderness before the Europeans arrived. So there's a great question that comes up. And lastly, Heart of Darkness is going to discuss the need to educate the indigenous population by Western standards. And there is this idea that pervades most of colonial literature that what we're trying to do is we're trying to educate, we're trying to uplift, we're trying to educate, we're going to convert them to Christianity, we're going to make their lives better. And this is all based on some Western perceptions and standards. And there's this idea that the knowledge that is provided is better than the indigenous knowledge itself, which obviously is problematic because that can't possibly be true. How can a Westerner understand things by a different perception if they have never looked at the world through different eyes? So, what I would like to do as the end of fiction is I want you to have a discussion of Charles Marlowe, who is our narrator. So when Charles Marlowe arrives in Africa, he is going there because he wants to go like an adventurer. He wants to go experience the wilderness and the wildness of Africa. And he wants to go and discover. What do you think about this attitude? Does it make him better because he's not there to earn money? Or does that make him equally problematic because why should we have to engage with a character who is still, even though it may not be done for profit, still wants to do some form of colonialization? I hope I'm not giving away my opinions and ideas through my tone. For the next learning outcome, which is quite an intense section, you need to have read An Image of Africa, Racism in Conrad's Heart of Darkness by Chinua Achebe. It's a very in-depth reading, and we're going to go through some of the sections that he discusses in learning outcome 2. Okay, I also have some useful additional sources that you can go watch. A lot of them, I will have them at the end of every single set of slides. They are often very useful just to put us in the right mindset for what we're supposed to be engaging with. Okay, good luck.